the fear too. So I mean, people got to understand that fear. Like, okay, yeah, big deal. Someone goes to jail for 5-6 years.
Nothing.
They're going to be more angry when they get out, and maybe they'll come after me. How will I ever feel safe? So for me, I've definitely supported enough people to know that just disappearing off that perpetrator's radar is probably a more, this is just going to make you, that's just a better solution. To just disappear and not have, so engaging in the criminal justice process can actually escalate the harm or just the perception of your harm.
Yeah. And would she have got compensation had she not helped the police for the prosecution? Collaborate?
I mean, she would have been eligible to apply, yeah.
Okay.
She would have been eligible to apply.
No.
So yes, so again, you don't have to have gone to court
to get compensation
and have a successful prosecution in order to get the compensation. But again, it was just sort of luck that there was a corresponding state offense to to what she had experienced. So look, I guess what it is we've seen a range of scenarios in the sex industry that don't conform to the stereotypes.
What did you mean by saying she broke all the stereotypes?
I think I think there's a stereotype out there that, Asian sex workers are kind of helpless victims, waiting to be rescued, and that they all view them, that they all want to leave the sex industry. They're only, in the sex industry because they've been pushed into the sex industry or kidnapped into the sex industry or, So, I mean, I think she just, as a witness, too, in the court, she really, there's a lot of opportunities that the defense has to tear you down because you're a sex worker, because they can play into all those stereotypes. But in that case, she never let it, she understood the context really well. She understood that they would try to take that angle. She understood that they were going to lie. She understood they were going to use the stereotypes. But I also think in that case, the judge was highly protective of her, and that made a big difference. So she got lucky with the judge because the judge stopped a lot of inappropriate behavior from the defense counsel. And that's really
the defense
important.
was trying to say you wanted to be in the sex
industry.
Yeah,
they were just using all kinds of whatever they could use. And she just she just didn't fit the stereotype.
And generally, you were talking about these stereotypes before when I asked you about her in particular. You said there is a lot of stereotypes about.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, don't you think?
I know.
If you just people have their own ideas, there's just a lot of assumptions about why women work in the sex industry and how they are engaged in the sex industry that are just, just the public just doesn't know, I've learned a lot since I came here. And I think I've been able to learn a lot because we have we have sex workers that are empowered to speak for themselves. I was put in the position of speaking about sex work in the United States, and I was like, I don't know, I'm not a sex worker, I'm not an expert on the sex industry. Stop asking me. I was doing anti-trafficking work there. It was like, I don't know, So for me, it was a huge relief to come here and to be able to meet sex worker organizations that are funded by our government, and recognized to be able to stand up and speak for themselves. And and I find that they don't say anything that they can't back up with evidence, which is very impressive. There's a lot of other organizations that just say stuff.
Yeah.
And if you kind of, scratch below the surface, you'll find, okay, they don't actually have evidence for that.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm saying some of this stuff that you hear about boats coming from, people shouldn't say that.
What about this project like Grey Men and Somali?
Yeah.
Do you know? Are you aware of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is sometimes too, it's the power of this idea that doing something is better than doing nothing, but you can do something really badly, and it's actually more harmful than doing nothing. So.
And how do you think that the aspect what is this our project is also concentrating on is the fact that sexuality and victimhood attached to sexual behavior in the case of sex worker, for instance, or sexual identity, or sexual offences related to forced marriage, how this is being, it creates a particular focus.
Yeah.
And humanitarian organizations particularly want to invest in that because it links to a specific kind of victimhood that wakes up a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, especially amongst, men who want to save women, So, I mean, that whole conversation's been going on, for years around all the gender aspect, the victimhood thing, the, women and girls not having agency in this conversation, or,
But it's also LGBT.
Yeah.
So it's about sexuality.
And again, so there was a period of time where I was hearing in the community about transgender Thai sex workers being trafficked. But when I went and asked people, nobody.
When was that?
Oh, I don't know. It was probably 6 years ago. It's quite a while ago. So,
Was there like some media?
Just stories.
Media.
No, it was just stories and people who'd said to me, oh, you guys should, do some outreach to that group because they're trafficked people. I'm like, well, where? Yes, if someone's been trafficked, we want to support them to know what their rights and options are and to get out of that situation, and they don't have to talk to the police, we'll still help them. But, anyway, just people say stuff. And people say stuff to the point where it starts to become, people think it's fact. Like I went
to... organizations do work with that. They do get funding, they do, fundraise at least, because of all of these stories. There is like a huge system of protection.
I went to Kiribati. Do you know where Kiribati is? It's this teeny tiny island out in the Pacific. I went to Kiribati to do training for police officers because a story was circulating around Kiribati women going onto fishing vessels and becoming sex slaves. They were like, homeless and runaway young women in the Kiribati community, and you'd have fishing vessels from Korea and, Vietnam, from all over the world in the local waters, and that they were going on to these boats, as for sex work, and then they wound up as sex slaves. So this was like a story created by one concerned church group in Kiribati who had their own ideas about, what was going on. And so we actually, the U.S. State Department paid for me to go there along with my colleagues and provide training to the police. And what we learned when we got there was that's totally not what was going on. What was going on was sex work. Women were going onto the boats, hanging out with the fishermen, having food, having a good time, and then leaving. And some of them actually developed relationships with the men that were long term, and they left Kiribati and got married and went, overseas with them. So it was were they vulnerable? Were they vulnerable to? Is there a possibility that and it's not legal actually for them to enter onto the ship, like they're not supposed to do that. There's an immigration kind of issue there. Did it create vulnerability potentially if you're on the boat? Yeah. Bunch of guys in an isolated environment, you're not supposed to be there. Is it possible that something bad could happen? Yeah, but it wasn't sex trafficking. Yeah. So this one organization created a story that wound up in the tip report that resulted in myself and some other folks going to train police on how they were going to stop sex trafficking, which it was wrong. It was false. When we got there, we found out that and what ended up happening was they solved the problem themselves. They just started policing the boats, and they levied huge fines when they found women on the ships, and they stopped going on the ships.
So
then the crew started coming on shore.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So it was like this big drama around.
And how would you because I know that you've got expertise of two of the main countries that you're looking at. So how does it compare the situation of trafficking and trafficking protection in the US and here?
I mean, I've been away for quite a long time now. So, I mean, I think there's a much more aggressive response in the U.S. to.
What do you mean by that?
I think the U.S. has invested a lot more money. That's where training and education of frontline professionals has trickled down pretty far in the U.S. So your average, if you're like a Department of Labor inspector or even a healthcare worker, you would have received some information and education on how to spot the signs of slavery and what to do. And they have a national hotline. They have so many things that Australia won't even consider at this point. I think they have a much more aggressive response to detecting and supporting victims. I mean, there's a million probably
Is
things.
there more trafficking going on as well?
Yeah, a lot more, I think, because, porous borders and, 300 million people versus 25 million people here. So, and I think, people coming on boats, like people are coming here on temporary visas, on a plane. So I think the porous borders make a big difference in the U.S. So I think the context is really different. And sex work is pretty much illegal everywhere in the United States. So there's been a huge criminal aspect to the sex industry forever in America. Whereas my position is not a Salvation Army position, but my position, my thoughts based on living here is that a decriminalized system is better.
So there is more being done on trafficking, but the actual protection and the actual support of people who incur rights violations related to sex work is poorer because of the criminalization of sex work.
Oh, I just think that sex work is highly controlled by dangerous third party people. And there's so many vulnerable people in the U.S. So I mean, you've got two different groups, right? You've got American born. You've got American. A lot of runaways, and we've got a lot of poverty and dysfunction and broken things in the United States, which has just gotten worse and worse and worse over the years. And there were a lot of people, only a few people working in that space to try to help people that were, being controlled by pimps, and pretty horrible stuff actually that's been going on there for forever that the government never paid attention to or cared about, right? Then when we started working on the anti-trafficking stuff in the context of migration and migrants being trafficked to the United States, and that started to get attention and resources and results, those folks that were working on what is now called domestic trafficking, they were really strategic and smart to
get in there.
Well, leverage that. And now there's a lot of money being spent to try to address, that. They call it domestic trafficking now, but that's a real issue.
But does it work for the victims or does it result in criminalizing sex workers and therefore?
Sex work is criminalized, right? So it's So is the United States ever going to legalize or decriminalize? No, they're not going to. That's not going to happen.